3 days before it happened, that motorcycle was scheduled to be crushed. Not sold, not donated. Crushed, along with the rest of the scrap metal sitting in a garage that hadn't been opened in almost 30 years, hauled off by a cleanup crew who had absolutely no idea what they were about to throw away. If one appraiser hadn't happened to be running 15 minutes late for a completely unrelated job that morning, the most valuable motorcycle most collectors will ever hear about would have ended up as a pile of scrap metal at a recycling yard outside of Reading, Pennsylvania, and nobody on earth would have ever known. This is the story of how a machine worth well over $1 million sat quietly rotting in a garage behind a modest house for 3 decades, and how the reclusive old man who owned it turned out to be hiding something far more valuable than the motorcycle itself. His name was Arthur Kessler, though almost nobody in town called him that. To his neighbors, he was just Artie, the quiet old mechanic who lived alone at the end of Birchwood Lane, the kind of man who waved politely but never once accepted an invitation to a barbecue or a holiday gathering in the 40 years he lived there. His garage stayed padlocked at all times, even during the day when he was clearly home, and the few kids in the neighborhood who dared to peek through the gap in the boarded-up window only ever saw shapes under tarps and a workbench covered in tools. The general assumption around Birchwood Lane, repeated so many times it had basically become fact, was that Artie was a hoarder, an eccentric old man clinging to a garage full of junk he'd never actually get rid of. Nobody bothered asking him why. Nobody really bothered asking him anything. And when Artie passed away quietly in his sleep at 84 years old, the entire street mostly just felt sorry for a lonely old man who apparently didn't have much of anybody and moved on with their week. His only living relative was a niece named Sarah, a woman in her 40s living 2 states away who had met her great-uncle maybe a handful of times in her entire life, at family funerals, and not much else. She inherited the house purely because there was nobody else left to inherit it, and when she finally drove out to deal with the estate, she brought exactly the attitude you'd expect from someone clearing out a stranger's belongings, which is to say, she hired the fastest, cheapest cleanup company she could find, and told them to haul away anything that wasn't obviously valuable. The garage, packed floor to ceiling with what looked like 40 years of accumulated junk, was first on the list. And this is where the story almost ended before it ever really began. The cleanup crew spent an entire morning hauling boxes, tools, and scrap metal out to a dumpster, working their way steadily toward the back of the garage, where something large sat completely covered under 3 layers of moving blankets and a tarp so filthy it had turned the same gray as the concrete floor beneath it. One of the workers, a younger guy who mostly just wanted to get the job done and go home, was actually reaching to drag the whole thing out to the dumpster pile when an older man named Ray, an independent appraiser who had been called out to a different property down the street entirely and was simply cutting through the alley as a shortcut, happened to glance through the open garage door. He stopped walking so fast, the woman he was with nearly ran into his back. Ray had spent almost 30 years appraising vintage motorcycles and classic cars for auction houses and private collectors, and there was exactly one detail visible under that filthy tarp, a single curve of a fender peeking out near the edge. That made every instinct in his body go off at once. He asked the crew to stop. They looked at him like he was insane. He asked again, more firmly this time, and then he walked straight into that garage without waiting for permission and lifted the corner of the tarp himself. What was underneath stopped him cold. It was a motorcycle unlike anything Ray had seen outside of a museum or a private collector's climate-controlled vault. A hand-built factory racing machine from the mid-1950s, one of an extraordinarily small production run built for a professional racing team before the entire program was shut down, and most of the bikes were either destroyed, lost, or simply vanished into private hands and were never seen again. He knew the chassis numbering conventions well enough to recognize what he was looking at within about 10 seconds, and his hands were actually shaking slightly as he checked the frame for a serial number partially hidden under decades of dust and old oil. When he found it and confirmed what it matched, he had to sit down on an overturned bucket for a minute just to process what he was looking at. Sarah, standing in the driveway completely confused about why some random man had just stopped her cleanup crew mid-job, walked over to find out what on earth was going on. When Ray finally explained, in the calmest voice he could manage, that the motorcycle sitting under that tarp was very likely one of only a handful surviving examples of its kind, and that a comparable bike had sold at auction for well over $1 million just 2 years earlier, Sarah didn't say anything at all for almost a full minute. She just stared past him into the garage at the machine her uncle had apparently protected behind a padlocked door for 4 decades, while everyone on that street quietly assumed he was simply a lonely old hoarder. But the motorcycle itself, as staggering as its value turned out to be, was not actually the most shocking part of what they found in that garage. That came later, once Ray convinced Sarah to let him properly document everything before anyone touched another single item, and they started going through the boxes the cleanup crew had already pulled halfway out to the dumpster. Inside one of those boxes, wrapped carefully in cloth like something meant to be protected, was a stack of photographs, race programs, and handwritten journals going back decades. And that's when the real story of Arthur Kessler finally started to come together. In the 1950s, before he was the quiet old man at the end of Birchwood Lane, Artie had been a mechanic for that same small factory racing team, working alongside a rider named Danny Voss, his closest friend since childhood, the two of them having grown up together, apprenticed together, and eventually built a career together, chasing checkered flags across a handful of regional circuits. The journals made it clear these two weren't just co-workers. They were practically brothers. Photograph after photograph showed them laughing together in the pits, arms slung over each other's shoulders, young and completely certain the world was theirs to take on. And then, tucked between 2 race programs from a summer meet in 1958, was a newspaper clipping that explained everything. Danny Voss had died in a crash during a race on that exact motorcycle, the very machine sitting under that tarp, after a mechanical failure that the article described only briefly before moving on to other news. But Artie's journal entry from that same week went into much more detail, written in the shaky, grief-soaked handwriting of a 26-year-old who believed with everything in him that a preparation mistake he made himself, a bolt he thought he double-checked, had killed his best friend in front of a grandstand full of people. The team itself had been one of those small, fiercely proud outfits that never had the budget of the big factory efforts, but made up for it with obsessive attention to detail, hand-fitting parts that larger teams simply bought off the shelf, and building a reputation for punching well above their weight on race day. Danny was their star rider, fearless, in a way that made him beloved by fans and mildly terrifying to everyone who loved him off the track. And Artie was the mechanic who quietly kept him alive week after week, the kind of behind-the-scenes craftsman who never got his name in the papers, but who every rider on that circuit would have traded for in a heartbeat. It's exactly the kind of small, scrappy team that racing history tends to forget within a generation, which is part of why a machine like this, tied to a story like this, is worth so much more to serious collectors than its rarity alone would suggest. The team disbanded within the year of the accident. Most of the surviving bikes were sold off, scrapped, or scattered into private hands and lost to history entirely, the way so much of that early era of racing simply vanished once the money and the will to keep going dried up. But Artie, in one of the only truly defiant acts of his otherwise quiet life, refused to let that particular motorcycle go anywhere. He bought it off the team for whatever he could scrape together, brought it home, and locked it away, not to hide it out of shame, but because some part of him could not stand the idea of it being ridden, sold, or displayed by anyone who hadn't actually known Danny. But there was still one more discovery left, tucked into the very last box. That finally explained the man everyone on Birchwood Lane had spent 40 years quietly misunderstanding. It was a folder of bank statements and old letters, none of them ever sent, documenting something Artie had apparently done in complete secrecy for over 30 years. Starting just a few years after the accident, he had been anonymously sending money, modest but consistent, to Danny's widow and later to Danny's 2 children, covering things quietly in the background. A school tuition payment here, a mortgage assistance check there, always sent through a lawyer, always unsigned, always without a single word of explanation attached. He had lived alone in that small house, worked as an ordinary mechanic for the rest of his career, and spent decades of his own modest income supporting a family that likely had no idea where any of it was coming from, all while the one possession that could have made him wealthy sat locked behind a garage door because he simply could not bring himself to profit from the very thing that had taken his best friend's life. Sarah sat on that overturned bucket where Ray had been sitting only an hour earlier, holding a stack of unsent letters written by a man she barely knew, and finally understood exactly why he never came to family gatherings, why he never talked about his past, why the entire street had quietly written him off as a strange, lonely old hoarder for 40 straight years. He wasn't hiding junk behind that padlocked door. He was keeping a promise that nobody, including the family he had been secretly supporting for 3 decades, ever knew he was keeping. With Ray's help, Sarah managed to track down Danny Voss's now grown children, both in their 60s, both completely unaware that the mysterious, anonymous support their family had quietly received for over 30 years had come from their father's old racing partner. When Sarah finally sat down with them and explained everything, showed them the journals, the photographs, the letters, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The motorcycle itself eventually did go to auction, exactly the kind of headline-grabbing sale collectors dream about. But Sarah made sure a significant portion of what it sold for went directly to Danny's children, closing a circle that Arthur Kessler had spent his entire adult life quietly tending to in complete silence. That garage stayed locked for 40 years because one man believed that guilt was something you were supposed to carry alone, in private, without ever asking for forgiveness or recognition. Nobody on that street ever knew the truth, not because Artie didn't trust them, but because he never once thought his own grief and loyalty were something worth explaining to anyone. It took a cleanup crew 15 minutes away from turning a piece of racing history into scrap metal, and one appraiser cutting through an alley at exactly the right moment for the world to finally learn what kind of man had been living quietly at the end of Birchwood Lane the entire time. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved me while I was putting it together, then you already understand why I keep chasing stories like this one. Because every once in a while, the most valuable thing sitting in a forgotten garage was never actually the motorcycle at all. Stick around, because there are more stories exactly like Artie and Danny's still sitting quietly behind padlocked doors all over this country, waiting for the right person to finally lift the tarp, and I intend to keep finding them.